There's this huge country located in the Horn of Africa that continues to suffer from one conflict after another since independence. The situation is so bad that just hearing its name alone sends shivers down spines. This is Somalia, a land that has come to be defined by relentless war, piracy, and terrorism. But why, one must wonder? Why has this one nation become synonymous with chaos? Is it the scars of colonialism that's never healed? Is it the iron-fisted dictators whose oppression bred violence? Or has Somalia become a battlefield for foreign rivalries, a proxy arena for conflicts extending far beyond its borders? To understand why peace constantly slips through Somalia's fingers, we have to retrace its tragic path from brutal colonial occupation through euphoric independence turned sour to anarchy and the rise of extremist militias. I want to tell you the story of why, even today in 2025, Somalia still fights for survival. I'll show you how a land of promise became trapped in endless war and why, after generations, Somalis still long for peace that seems just out of reach. This is the story of why Somalia is always at war. It all began in the late 19th century, a time when European empires sliced Africa apart like a piece of cake. Before this European invasion, the Somali people thrived as a culturally unified society, even though organized into many clans without a single state. It was precisely this clan structure that European powers exploited, drawing arbitrary borders that cut deep into Somali life. In the 1980s, Britain established a protectorate over the north through treaties with clan chiefs and even an agreement with Ethiopia's emperor Menelik II to fix its borders. They called it British Somaliland. Italy meanwhile secured control over much of the south, which came to be known as Italian Somaliland. The Italians gained control by striking deals with local sultans and tribal leaders between 1897 and 1907. By the early 20th century, what is today Somalia was split into British and Italian colonies, with other Somali populated regions handed to France, an area today known as Djibouti. Ethiopia took possession of the Ogaden region and Kenya the northern frontier district. These artificially drawn borders created under colonial rule left ethnic Somalis divided among 5 different territories, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. Under colonial occupation, Somalis experienced both neglect and exploitation. The British in the north governed indirectly and invested way little. They were okay seeing this region of British Somaliland become an economic backwater of nomadic herders. The Italians in the south meanwhile developed plantations and infrastructures with a more hands-on approach, even though it was development for their own benefit, often enforced with harsh labor conditions. These differing colonial policies deepened north-south disparities. The agrarian south saw more investment, while the pastoral north was largely neglected, creating lasting inequalities in wealth and infrastructure between the two regions. The European colonizers also played clans against each other, formalizing clan identities for divide and rule purposes. Somalis didn't always take whatever the colonizers dished out though. They rebelled against the system. One famous resistance leader was Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, whom the British nicknamed the Mad Mullah. Starting around 1899, Hassan rallied Somali clans in a dervish movement aimed at expelling the colonizers and their local collaborators. For 2 decades, his forces fought the British in one of the most brutal anti-colonial wars in Africa. The British responded with equally fierce tactics, including in 1920, the first ever aerial bombing in Africa, which obliterated Hassan's stronghold. Though the Dervish rebellion was crushed, Hassan became a nationalist icon for future generations. Other Somalis too resisted colonial rule, from poets who wrote biting anti-colonial verse to female activists like Hawo Tako, who was killed while trying to protect her people. This legacy of resistance gave Somalis a proud narrative of unity. They could unite quickly against an external enemy, such as European colonies. But once that external threat was gone, they returned to their default state of internal divisions. By the mid-20th century, notably during World War II, the British temporarily occupied all Somali territories, including those under Italian and French control, briefly administering a greater Somalia under one banner. This moment, though under colonial supervision, allowed Somali nationalists to dream of unifying their people. They aspired to a greater Somalia that would reclaim all Somali inhabited lands, a British and Italian Somalia, French Djibouti, Ethiopia's Ogaden, and even Kenya's Somali North. As European empires became weakened in the aftermath of World War II, Somali nationalism began to surge. Somali intellectuals and veterans formed political movements like the Somali Youth League, SYL, which became the leading nationalist party. This nationalist vision would later play a huge role in Somalia's wars. But first came independence and a fleeting moment of hope. July 1st, 1960, a new dawn breaks over Somalia. Independence had finally arrived, bringing an electrifying sense of unity and possibility. After decades under the shadow of colonialism, Somalis stood together, proud and hopeful, believing they could build their own future. British Somaliland in the north and Italian Somaliland in the south both gained independence but decided to merge to form the Somali Republic. For the first time, Somalis had their own sovereign nation. There was a euphoric sense of possibility. At independence, Somali leaders and citizens alike believed that having a state of their own, run by competent Somalis, would finally redeem the country from the ravages of colonial rule. The new nation began its journey as a multi-party parliamentary democracy, one of the few in Africa at that time. Despite many challenges, it has some proud achievements. 2 national elections were held. In 1967, Somalia's founding president, Aden Abdullahi Osman, peacefully stepped down after losing at the ballot box. The first African leader to voluntarily hand over power via an election. Somalia earned praise as an early African democracy. The leaders of that era were hailed as Africa's first democrats. Somalis took immense pride in their new nation, and a spirit of unity prevailed in the early years of independence. However, beneath the optimism, cracks were already forming. The unification of North and South Somalia had occurred hastily, and Northerners soon felt marginalized in the new republic. The more populous South, that is the former Italian territory, dominated politics and economics, while the North, former British Somaliland, found itself underrepresented. Old regional and clan tensions, which had been amplified by the uneven colonial development, soon reared its ugly head, presenting the new nation with a new kind of trouble. The prestigious Isak clan of the north, for instance, suddenly saw itself become a minority in a nation now led largely by southern clans, including the Darod and Hawiye. Clan-based competition quickly infected the multi-party system. By the late 1960s, Somalia had over 60 registered political parties, many of them nothing more than vehicles for clan interests vying for government spoils. Soon enough, politics became less about ideology and more about which clan could capture state resources. Corruption and nepotism soon exploded in the country. Things got worse when ambitious politicians manipulated clan loyalties to gain power. In 1967, Abdirashid Ali Shamake was elected president, but 2 years later, on October 15, 1969, he was assassinated in a widely debated circumstance. This calamity proved to be the breaking point for Somalia's fragile democracy. Amid the turmoil and public disillusionment with corrupt civilian elites, the army saw an opening and they seized it. On October 21, 1969, military officers led by Major General Mohammed Siad Barre staged a bloodless coup d'etat, taking control of the country. The jailed politicians suspended the constitution and announced that they were saving the nation from chaos. Barre, a former colonial-era police officer who had trained under the Italians, emerged as the strong man of the new regime. Many Somalis, weary of clannish bickering, initially welcomed the military takeover. It promised efficiency, an end to corruption, and a forceful push for development. little did they know that this revolution would soon morph into a dictatorship that would drag Somalia into decades of war and repression.
The evil forces of colonialism and racism still remain to be most pressing problem facing both the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations.
When Siad Barre took control in 1969, he was met with cautious optimism. General Siad Barre presented himself as a man with grand vision for Somalia. Upon seizing power, Barre proclaimed a revolutionary regime of scientific socialism and Somali nationalism. He quickly set about remaking the country. Barre formed a Supreme Revolutionary Council of military officers and technocrats, and for a time, he genuinely pursued ambitious reforms. The new government launched mass literacy campaigns and in 1972 introduced a standard written script for the Somali language using the Latin alphabet, a point of pride as Somalia had finally put its own language into writing nationwide. Infrastructure was built, new roads and ports, and women were encouraged to participate in public life like never before. Barre's regime also tried to eradicate the divisive influence of clan allegiance. The government banned identifying by clan, burned effigies symbolizing clanism, and pushed the idea that all Somalis should think of themselves as one family. In these early years, Barre cultivated a benevolent strongman image. Posters plastered Mogadishu with his angular-faced portrait alongside Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin as he courted both communist allies and Arab nationalist friends in a curious ideological blend. Behind the propaganda, Barre showed his mastery of balancing superpower interests to Somalia's advantage, at least initially. You see, the Cold War was at its height and the Horn of Africa was a strategic prize. In the 1960s, the United States had heavily backed Ethiopia, Somalia's arch-enemy, as a regional bulwark against communism. Feeling threatened by a US-armed Ethiopia, Somalia under President Shamake had turned to the Soviet Union for support in 1964. This was after Washington tricked Mogadishu to accept a measly gift of 6 jeeps mounted with anti-tank guns instead of the weapons it had requested for. The Soviets happily stepped in, supplying arms and training to Somalia, even as they curried favor with Ethiopia as well. When Siad Barre took power in 1969, he leaned strongly into the Soviet camp, and the Soviets, seeing an opportunity, signed a major friendship treaty with Somalia in 1974. Barre declared Somalia to be a socialist state, albeit one with its own unique flavor, and he received massive shipments of Soviet weaponry. By the mid-1970s, Somalia's army was one of the best armed in sub-Saharan Africa. Barre had not forgotten Somali nationalism, however. His regime loudly championed the cause of Greater Somalia, uniting all Somali peoples, even as it preached Marxism. This nationalist streak set him on a collision course with neighboring Ethiopia. The long-standing Somali irredentist dream focused especially on the Ogaden, a vast Somali inhabited region across the border in eastern Ethiopia. Somalia regarded the Ogaden as Somali territory, unjustly handed to Ethiopia by colonial powers, that is, the British, who had gifted the Ogaden to Ethiopia in 1948, an event Somalis likened to their own version of the Palestine tragedy. In the early 1970s, Somalia backed guerrillas of the Western Somali Liberation Front in launching an insurgency inside the Ogaden against Ethiopian rule. Tensions with Ethiopia kept rising. In 1977, those tensions exploded into open war.
The Somalis seized large tracts of the Ogaden Desert. The Soviets tried to stop the advance through diplomacy.
In July 1977, Barre made the fateful decision to invade the Ogaden. In a swift offensive covertly coordinated with WSLF, the Somali National Army crossed the border and initially drove deep into the Ogaden, seizing towns and routing Ethiopian forces. Barre had gambled that the Soviets would support him over Ethiopia, or at least stay neutral. But he was gravely mistaken. The Soviet Union, now allied with Mengistu's Marxist Ethiopia, felt more strategically tied to Addis Ababa. Moscow abruptly switched sides, cutting off aid to Somalia and instead massively arming Ethiopia. In a dramatic Cold War realignment, Soviet advisors and a contingent of 10,000 Cuban troops rushed in to help Ethiopia fight off Somalia's invasion. Bela found himself isolated. The Western powers were reluctant to come to his aid in what looked to them like an act of aggression. In fact, one US diplomat later noted that President Jimmy Carter viewed Bela as the instigator and was not about to bail him out. By March 1978, the tide had turned disastrously. Ethiopian forces with Soviet-supplied tanks and Cuban soldiers expelled the Somali army from the Ogaden. Bela's dream of a quick victory evaporated. Somalia's defeat was comprehensive and humbling. Bela, who had fancied himself a triumphant nationalist, like an African Napoleon, saw his army crushed and his Soviet patrons become bitter enemies. He would expel the remaining Soviets from Somalia. In Mogadishu, the Soviet expulsion was celebrated by ordinary Somalis like a second Independence Day. They felt rid of meddling foreigners, but the reality was that Somalia had lost its superpower benefactor and gained nothing in return. The war had drained the economy and killed thousands. It also sent a flood of refugees pouring into Somalia. By 1979, Somalia was hosting over 350,000 Ogaden refugees in camps, mostly women and children. The strain on resources was immense. Most critically though, the Ogaden War proved to be Siad Barre's political undoing. The defeat shattered the aura of invincibility around his regime. At home, discontent within the military and society grew. Almost immediately after the war, in 1978, disgruntled army officers, mainly from the Majitin clan, once part of Barre's coalition, attempted a coup to oust Barre. Well, the coup failed and Barre's security forces executed or imprisoned dozens of plotters. But it was a sign that cracks were widening in the regime. Everyone realized that Siad Barre was totally unable to manage either the war or what came after it. Barre reacted to these threats by leaning into dictatorship with even greater ferocity. He increasingly ruled through an inner circle drawn from his own Marihan clan and allied clans of his Darod clan family, while excluding and brutally suppressing those clans perceived as enemies. The promise to erase clanism gave way to a reality in which Barre practiced his own clan favoritism. During the 1980s, Somalia descended into tyranny. Barre's regime became notorious for human rights abuses. Arbitrary arrests, torture, and killings of dissidents were commonplace, as documented by Amnesty International in 1988. Nowhere was the repression more vicious than in the north. The Isa clan of the north, feeling marginalized and victimized by the Southern-led government, had formed a guerrilla group called the Somali National Movement, SNM. By the mid-1980s, the SNM was waging an armed insurrection in the northern regions, former British Somaliland, against Barre's rule. Barre's response was merciless. He unleashed the full might of his US-supplied military against his own citizens. In 1988, government forces led by Barre's son-in-law, General Morgan, attacked the northern cities of Hargeisa and Burao, areas supportive of the SNM, with punishing force. Fighter jets bombed the cities indiscriminately and artillery shelled civilian neighborhoods. Hargeisa was destroyed block by block. Foreign observers later dubbed it Africa's Dresden due to the scale of devastation. Thousands of unarmed civilians were massacred, and around 500,000 Somali civilians, mostly Isaac, fled across the border into refugee camps. Inside the regime, even some of Barre's longtime associates grew uneasy at the level of brutality. Mohammed Aden Sheikh, a former minister who had been part of Barre's revolutionary government, later reflected on how the system slowly turned murderous. Officials like him had joined Barre with idealistic hopes to modernize Somalia, but what was at stake in politics became merely the spoils for each clan, and power was maintained only through violence. Barre's security services became even more ruthless in crushing dissent. By the late 1980s, Somalia was effectively a police state. Yet, even this iron-fisted rule could not keep the country from fracturing. In 1986, Bela was badly injured in an automobile accident, which left him weakened and reportedly dependent on medications. Opportunistic rivals within his regime, including his own family members, started jockeying for succession. With the dictator's grip loosening, multiple clan-based rebel groups gained momentum across Somalia. Not only the SNM in the north, but also the United Somali Congress (USC), based in the Hawiye clan of central Somalia, and the Somali Patriotic Movement (SPM) in the Ogaden Darod clans in the south. These groups found sanctuary and support in neighboring countries. Notably, Ethiopia's ruler Mengistu, eager for revenge after the Ogaden War, became a sponsor of several Somali rebel movements, arming them to destabilize Bela. By 1990, Somalia was in a full-fledged state of insurgency and economic collapse. Bela's regime, isolated internationally and despised at home, was on its last legs. Ordinary Somalis were utterly exhausted by years of oppression and worsening living conditions. This set the stage for a full-state collapse and a descent into anarchy that would bring Somalia's name to world headlines for all the wrong reasons.
As survivors of numerous battles, many young fighters believe the secret of their success lies in their willingness to die.
In January 1991, Siad Barre's 21-year dictatorship came to a violent end. Rebel militias of the USC, led by General Mohammed Farah Aidid, fought their way into the capital Mogadishu. Bela fled for his life, escaping the city and eventually going into exile. His departure marked the collapse of the Somali state. The government disintegrated and no central authority took its place. What followed was a power vacuum, and into that void rushed the forces of clan factionalism that Bela had long suppressed. Mogadishu erupted into chaos as rival clan warlords turned on each other. General Aidid and a rival USC faction led by Ali Mahdi Mohammed clashed over who would rule the capital. A brutal power struggle ensued between these once allied warlords, and thousands of Somali civilians were killed or wounded in the fighting. Ali Mahdi hastily declared himself president of Somalia, but this meant little on the ground. Real power lay with whichever militia held the most streets and checkpoints. The months that followed Bela's ouster were among the darkest in Somalia's history. With no government, heavily armed clan militias looted freely and settled old scores. In Mogadishu, entire neighborhoods were razed by shelling as the city became a patchwork of clan fiefdoms. Somalia, as a unified nation, effectively ceased to exist. The northwestern region, known previously as British Somaliland before independence, quickly broke away. In May 1991, Isa clan leaders in the north declared the formation of the Republic of Somaliland, asserting the independence of the territory that had meshed with Somalia in 1960. Somaliland's secession was a direct response to the atrocities their people had suffered. They no longer trusted the rule from Mogadishu. Over the ensuing years, Somaliland actually managed to establish a rough stability and a functioning local government. It remains unrecognized internationally, but effectively autonomous to this day. Meanwhile, the rest of Somalia fragmented into clan-based territories, controlled by warlords. In the south, General Aidid held much of Mogadishu and parts of the south. Ali Mahdi held other parts of the capital. Other warlords controlled the fertile riverine lands, yet others like Colonial Ahmed Jess and Morgan warred over the port city of Kismayo. In the northeast, Abdullahi Yusuf, a former coup plotter against Bela, set himself up as a leader of his Majitan clan's territory, which later became the Puntland Autonomous Region. There were at least a dozen mini-states and warlord fiefdoms, all fighting and shifting alliances in an ever-changing mosaic of conflict. Amid the warfare, a catastrophe unfolded: famine. With farms abandoned, markets closed, and militias hijacking food convoys, by late 1991, Somalia plunged into starvation. Hardest hit were the fertile inter-riverine regions in the south, traditionally the country's breadbasket, which had turned into battle zones. Civilians caught in these areas suffered the most. In 1992, as many as 350,000 Somalis, predominantly children, died from hunger, disease, and war combined. Shocking images of skeletal Somali children and desperate mothers made their way to international news broadcasts, awakening the conscience of the world. The famine, largely man-made by the war, spurred the first major international intervention in Somalia. In late 1992, the United Nations negotiated a ceasefire of sorts to allow aid delivery, and UN convoys began bringing food. But warlords often looted the aid, using hunger as a weapon. Frustrated by seeing food aid stolen while children died, the United States under President George H.W. Bush decided to lead a bold mission to secure relief operations. In December 1992, the UN Security Council authorized Operation Restore Hope, a US-led military mission to protect humanitarian deliveries in Somalia. American troops landed on the beaches of Mogadishu under TV cameras' glare, a dramatic moment that initially brought optimism. Somalis too greeted the foreign soldiers with hope at first. They were weary of warlords and welcomed anyone who could get food through. By mid-1993, the worst of the starvation had been alleviated and millions of lives were saved. However, if feeding the hungry was relatively easy, peace proved far more elusive. The foreign intervention, which expanded into a broader UN mission in 1993, soon became entangled in Somalia's internal conflicts. The UN forces, comprising American, Pakistani, Malaysian, Italian, and other troops, tried to disarm the warlords and restore order. But some faction leaders resisted fiercely, none more so than General Mohammed Farah Aidid in Mogadishu. Tensions between Aidid's militia and UN forces escalated through mid-1993, marked by ambushes and skirmishes. On October 3, 1993, the conflict reached a bloody climax in the incident that would become known simply as Black Hawk Down. In a botched attempt to arrest Aidid's lieutenant in Mogadishu, US Special Forces helicopters were shot out of the sky by his fighters. 2 Black Hawk helicopters crashed in the city, and what followed was an urban battle between stranded American soldiers and thousands of Somali gunmen and civilians in the surrounding area. When the smoke cleared, 18 US soldiers lay dead along with 1 Malaysian peacekeeper and hundreds of Somalis. Many civilians had been killed in the crossfire. The world was stunned by footage of a dead American crewman's body dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by a mob. It was a gruesome image that would sear itself into US public memory and dramatically shift international attitudes. The Black Hawk Down tragedy led to a swift policy reversal. The United States under President Bill Clinton decided to pull out of Somalia. The UN mission, now seen as too dangerous and futile, was effectively abandoned. By March 1994, American troops were gone and the last UN peacekeepers withdrew in 1995. Somalia was left once more to its warlords. The cost of this international intervention had been high. At least 140 peacekeepers were killed across various nations. Billions of dollars spent, yet Somalia still had no central government or lasting peace to show for it. And here was where things got from bad to worse.
A graduation ceremony for around 200 Alshabab fighters. They are fighting to overthrow the internationally recognized government of Somalia.
With international forces gone, Somalia spiraled deeper into despair and disorder. By 1996, Somalis were suffering heavily under the warlord reigns and continual fighting. Banditry was rampant. In many areas, gunmen set up roadblocks to extort travelers, and kidnappings and killings were frequent. Even though there were many warlords fighting for control, no single faction was strong enough to unify the country by force, and peace initiatives repeatedly failed. There were at least a dozen national reconciliation conferences between 1991 and 2000, some sponsored by the UN, others by regional African countries. But each time, the warlords either could not agree or would agree on a new government in talks, only to return home and abandon it. 14 attempts at forming a stable central government came and went. Throughout the 1990s, the international community largely kept Somalia at arm's length after the UN debacle. However, Somalia's troubles did not remain entirely contained within its borders. Refugees by the hundreds of thousands had spilled over to Kenya, Ethiopia, and beyond, and Somalia's instability began to export new problems. In the late 1990s, armed Somali bandits took to the sea. Piracy became a growing menace off Somalia's long coastline. Fishermen, angered by foreign ships illegally overfishing Somali waters, as well as former militiamen seeking profit, began hijacking passing cargo vessels. What started as sporadic incidents would, by the 2000s, escalate into a major international headache, with Somali pirate gangs disrupting maritime trade. As world leaders debated on how to fight this rise in piracy, another development in the late 1990s quietly started reshaping the conflict. There was now the rise of Islamist movements as an alternative to the warlords. You see, in neighborhoods of Mogadishu, local businessmen and religious leaders, fed up with the constant violence, set up community-based Sharia courts to dispense justice and curb crime. These courts often had militia wings to enforce their rulings and protect neighborhoods from bandits. Over time, the courts in different neighborhoods began uniting, forming networks like the Islamic Courts Union, known as ICU. They attracted respect from a war-weary populace by doing what the warlords failed to do, providing a degree of law and order. Additionally, a militant Islamist organization known as Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyah emerged in the 1990s with ties to international jihadist networks, and they fought to establish an Islamic state, though they were largely defeated in Puntland by 1997. When secular clan leaders proved impotent or predatory, many Somalis were willing to turn to religious-based leadership for salvation from the violence, and this opened doors to international interference and power play in Somalia. The toll of the prolonged statelessness was immense. By 1999, fighting had flared so much that even Ethiopia intervened directly, sending forces into Somali territory. In one episode, Ethiopian troops crossed into southwestern Somalia, ostensibly to hunt down Islamist rebels and to support allied Somali militias, capturing towns like Gabaher. Somalia had by then become a chessboard for regional powers' intrigues. Ethiopia and later Eritrea would arm rival proxies among Somali factions, each pursuing their own strategic interest. Ethiopia's primary goal was to prevent the rise of any strong Islamist or nationalist government in Somalia that might revive the irredentive threat to Ethiopian Somalis. By the end of the 1990s, an entire generation of young Somalis had grown up knowing nothing but chaos and war. This youth had no memory of a functioning government or peace. Many had lost parents or siblings. Many had seen the inside of refugee camps or picked up a gun themselves as teenagers. This trend continued into the 2000s as the global war on terror began. This new war allowed different proxies access into Somalia, where they armed different groups, turning the country into a war zone. In the early 2000s, a transitional federal government, TFG, was formed in exile in 2004, then based in Somalia by 2005, but they struggled to establish authority. Meanwhile, the grassroots Islamic court movement gained momentum. In 2006, the Islamic Courts Union, ICU, the coalition of Sharia courts we talked about earlier, they defeated the Mogadishu warlords who were being covertly funded by the US to counter terrorism. And briefly, they brought relative order to Mogadishu and much of southern Somalia. But the ICU's rise alarmed neighboring Ethiopia, which accused the ICU of harboring jihadists and being backed by Ethiopia's regional rival Eritrea. In December 2006, Ethiopia's military intervened in Somalia with tacit US support to prop up the transitional federal government and remove this ICU. Ethiopian troops captured Mogadishu in early 2007, removing the ICU from power. However, this victory was short-lived. The ICU's militant youth wing, known as Alshabab, survived and launched an insurgency against the Ethiopian and TFG forces. This guerrilla war raged on even as the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, deployed in 2007. AMISOM, a peacekeeping force of troops from Uganda, Burundi, and other African nations, struggled with limited resources, while unrelenting violence and warfare, as well as drought, flooding, and famine, continued to devastate Somalia. After years of fighting, Ethiopia's occupation ended by 2009, but Al-Shabaab only grew stronger, seizing control of large swaths of southern Somalia. In 2008 to 2009, a more moderate Islamist leader, Sheikh Sharif Ahmed, former ICU chairman, assumed Somalia's presidency under a new unity government. But Al-Shabaab's hardline stance left it isolated from this political process. From here, Al-Shabaab became a persistent Al-Qaeda-aligned insurgency, battling the Somali government and this African peacekeeping group that came to help the Somali government. By 2011, Al-Shabaab controlled most of south-central Somalia, even as a devastating famine struck that year. With international backing, AMISOM, that is this African peacekeeping group, and Somali forces gradually pushed Al-Shabaab out of major cities. The militants were driven from Mogadishu by August 2011 and from the vital southern port of Kismayo by September 2012. Meanwhile, neighboring Kenya had also intervened in late 2011 in an operation called Linda Nchi against Al-Shabaab in southern Somalia, later integrating its forces into this African peacekeeping group. In 2012, Somalia embarked on a new political transition. A provisional federal constitution was adopted. A federal parliament was selected by clan elders, and a new federal government of Somalia, FGS, was established in Mogadishu, the first permanent central government since 1991. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud took office, and Somalia's long transitional period was declared over. This was a hopeful step toward rebuilding state institutions. International naval patrols and a more stable government also contributed to a sharp decline in piracy off Somalia's coast after 2012. However, the state remained extremely weak outside the capital. Al-Shabaab, though expelled from cities, entrenched itself in rural areas and continued a deadly terror campaign, including high-profile bombings in Mogadishu and cross-border attacks such as the 2013 Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi. And as Al-Shabaab continued to hammer the country with bombs, Somalia's nascent institutions were being hampered by corruption, clan power struggles, and the outsized influence of warlords turned politicians. By 2016-2017, Somalia began another electoral cycle using an indirect clan-based voting system. In February 2017, Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo was elected president. He vowed to fight corruption and defeat Al-Shabaab, but his term soon became marked by political infighting and de facto alignment in the rapidly growing Gulf rivalries. It's been from one crisis to another for Somalia, and the nation doesn't seem to be getting any break. Now, I want to show you some of the external actors that have been behind the endless wars in Somalia. There have been multiple external players who have intervened in or funded proxies during Somalia's civil war, often pursuing their own strategic agendas. Over the years, Somalia has been a theater for regional and international rivalries, with Gulf Arab states, Turkey, and Western powers all become deeply involved. By the 2010s, a new set of players, notably Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey, had emerged as major sponsors and patrons in Somalia. These countries became Somalia's most generous supporters, with extensive financial aid and training programs. Turkey began its engagement around the 2011 famine, providing massive humanitarian relief. This blossomed into a broader partnership. Turkey built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure in Mogadishu. established its largest overseas embassy there and cultivated close ties with Somali's federal government. In 2017, Turkey opened a large military training base in Mogadishu where it has trained thousands of Somali soldiers, signaling a long-term security commitment. The UAE, for its part, initially focused on security assistance. It funded and trained counter-piracy forces in Puntland and a portion of the Somali National Army. For years, the UAE paid the salaries of certain Somali military units and managed an anti-piracy militia, the Puntland Maritime Police Force. Saudi Arabia also began wielding influence through direct cash infusion. For instance, in 2017, Saudi Arabia pledged $50 million in aid to Somalia, widely seen as an attempt to sway Mogadishu's stance in Riyadh's favor. The involvement of the Gulf states and Turkey escalated dramatically with the intra-Gulf rift that erupted in June 2017. Saudi Arabia and the UAE imposed a blockade on Qatar, accusing it of supporting Islamists. This feud spilled into Somalia, forcing Somali leaders to choose sides in exchange for patronage. President Farmajo tried to maintain neutrality in the Qatar crisis, but Riyadh and Abu Dhabi suspected his government of covertly leaning toward Qatar, given that Qatar was rumored to have helped finance Farmajo's 2017 campaign. In retaliation, the Saudi and UAE camp courted Somalia's federal member states and opposition. According to a crisis group report, Somalia's politics began mirroring the Gulf split, with pro-Qatar, Turkey and pro-Saudi UAE factions emerging. Throughout 2018 and 2019, this proxy tug-of-war continued. Qatar and Turkey doubled down on backing President Farmajo's administration, providing budgetary aid, equipment and investment in public works, while the UAE strengthened ties with federal states and opposition figures. A Washington Post report warned that Persian Gulf rivalries threatened to tear fragile Somalia apart. It noted that what progress Somalia had made was at risk of being undone by the Saudi-Qatar context being imported into its fragile polity. Western powers, meanwhile, maintained their own engagement, although theirs was more multilateral and security-focused. The United States, which had largely withdrawn after 1994, re-engaged in the mid-2000s to counter terrorism. The US backed Ethiopia's 2006 intervention and later became deeply involved in counter-terrorism operations, conducting drone strikes against Alshabab leaders and deploying a small number of special forces, notably supporting an elite Somali commando unit known as Danab. The European Union and its member states also contributed in important ways. The EU started a training mission for the Somali army in 2010 and also became a major bankroller of the African peacekeeping mission, funding troop allowances, and launched the Operation Atalanta naval mission in 2008 to combat piracy off Somalia's coast. Now, despite some progress on paper, establishing a federal government, a provisional constitution, and regular albeit indirect elections, Somalia remains one of the world's most fragile states. By many metrics, Somalia has consistently ranked at or near the bottom of global state stability indices. Al-Shabaab's relentless insurgency remains the foremost threat to Somalia's statehood. The group still controls large rural swaths and routinely strikes in the heart of Mogadishu. Even as Somali forces, with international help, have degraded Al-Shabaab's capabilities, the insurgents continue to adapt and endure. The security challenge posed by Shabab means Somalia's government spends much of its energy on basic survival, holding territory and securing officials rather than extending governance or providing services. It also means Somalia relies on foreign troops and US airstrikes for security, a sovereignty weakness. This insurgency deters investment, keeps millions displaced in crisis conditions, and perpetuates an economy of war. There is also the clan division and federal tensions. Somalia's society is clan-based and political allegiances often follow clan lines. While clan elders and traditional structures can have a stabilizing role, as seen in some local peace initiatives, at the national level, clan competition has repeatedly derailed state building. Power sharing in Somalia's government is quite fragile, often based on a formula known as 4.5, division among 4 major clan families plus a coalition of minority clans, which, while inclusive, also entrenches identity-based politics. The federal system intended to accommodate Somalia's regional diversity has instead become a source of frequent conflict between the center and states. Disputes over resource sharing, security control, and electoral procedures between Mogadishu and federal member states, that is Puntland, Jubaland, Southwest, Galmudug, Alshabab, and a self-declared independent Somaliland, are constant. These internal fractures are easily exploited by external actors. The lack of a stable settlement with Somaliland, which has governed itself peacefully since 1991 and seeks independence, is another major challenge for Somalia. There is also the problem of economic weakness and humanitarian crisis. Somalia's economy and human development indicators are extremely poor. This further weakens the state. Droughts and famines strike with alarming regularity in 1992, 2011, 2017, and 2022, and each time this tests the government's limited ability to respond. Massive humanitarian needs are met mostly by UN and NGOs, not by state institutions, which can breed public perception that the government is irrelevant to survival. Worst of all is external interference and dependence. Somalia's sovereignty is heavily compromised by external interference. While foreign aid and security assistance prop it up, the patronage dynamics also distort Somalia's polity. You see, the road to a stable Somali state will require not just military victories, but genuine reconciliation, economic recovery, and careful management of external partnerships, so they support rather than circumvent boarding institutions. Until then, Somalia will remain in effect a failed state, struggling to rebuild, vulnerable to both internal collapse and to becoming a chessboard for others' interest.